So, welcome to Aggie Allstars. Aggie Allstars' purpose is to celebrate those that have impacted the agricultural industry. It's for those that are curious about the history of our industry and how we get to where we are today, and those that helped us get us there. We're going to lead off Aggie Allstars with the co-creator of the concept, an entrepreneur who has started many businesses. In fact, he started the same one twice. He's one you have an equal chance of finding on a golf course, tending the net in a hockey game, or playing drums for his band, the GMOs. He's a husband, a father, and yes, he's an original Aggie All-Star. Len, how are you today, sir?
Hey, I'm great, Rhett. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, well, thank you. And you've got aptly placed painting behind you, celebrating dairy farming and agriculture, which kind of leads me to the first question is, kind of where did this passion for agriculture all come from, your humble beginnings?
Well, I had a kind of a unique upbringing, Rhett. I actually grew up in Oshawa, Ontario, and if you haven't heard of Oshawa, it's was very much a General Motors town. They had two plants. I think their Canadian head office was there, parts facility. So we lived right on a street in North Oshawa. And everyone on our street worked for the Motors. Probably 80% of the people in Oshawa did. We were a little different in that my dad was in the cattle export business. He was a drover, cattle dealer. Him and my uncle, this is a little funny. My dad's name was Bert and my uncle was Ernie. So we had Bert and Ernie, the original. They were German descent. So it was Bertold and Ernst became Bert and Ernie. So my dad drove to work like many dads did, but work for him was a 100-acre farm out in Brooklyn, Ontario. And of course, I would be there on weekends. And as soon as I was about 12 years old, I grew to my first height at 12 years old. My dad said, great, haying starts on Wednesday. So I used to spend weekends on the farm, but then as soon as I was 11 or 12, as most farm kids, the expectation was you were going to be on the farm. So I think it's always been in my blood. My dad's family emigrated from Germany just before World War II. In Germany, they were multi-generational farmers and business people, always involved with cattle, but they were also very entrepreneurial. So they would have a coal dealership or a machinery dealership. And even when they moved here, the same thing. One day, my dad came home and said, we just bought a variety store out in Brooklyn. And so I spent a few weeks stocking shelves and doing that kind of thing. So I'd always been around agriculture, but weirdly, my dad didn't consider himself a farmer. He considered himself a businessman, and he viewed the farm as a big used car lot, but instead of cars, they had cattle. So grew up with it. Everyone else's fathers came home at 5 o'clock and they looked good and they smelled good. And my dad would come home at 10 and he smelled like cow shit. And take my friends to school in his car, which also smelled like manure. So off on a different path. I guess I'm somewhat of a hybrid. I'm like Donnie and Marie, a little bit country and a little bit city.
Nice. Well,
Yeah.
and I didn't know some of that history either. It does explain a little bit of where you kind of got your entrepreneurial bug from, and your interest in a varied amount of different things too.
Yeah.
So you're on the farm, you got that passion for agriculture. At what point did you say, I want to pursue this, at least from an educational perspective? And then, like, how did that parlay from working on the farm, seeing what your family was doing, into how and what you took at Guelph, and how you kind of decided even to go to Guelph?
Well, Rhett, you're spinning a story that makes me sound like I was very strategic, but it really wasn't that at all. So a couple of things. Being in the cattle export business, you had to blood test all the animals, and the Health Canada lab was actually on the campus of the University of Guelph. So as soon as I could drive, my dad had me driving the blood samples to the health lab to have them tested before they got exported. So I was exposed to the University of Guelph and the city of Guelph at a young age. And this is going to sound a little sappy, but almost from the first time I drove onto campus, I fell in love with it. So I've always had this affinity to Guelph. it also led to a couple of good stories, like the time I got pulled over for speeding, and the officer asked me, what's in the cooler, sir? And I showed him, and it was blood. And so that took another explanation. So I always had this affinity for Guelph. Actually, back in the day, I'm a little older than you are, Rhett. We still had grade 13. I'm not sure if you did.
Yep. Yeah, I had grade 13. Yep.
Yeah, they had an accelerated program, and I actually thought about trying to get into Guelph early. But the other thing was, I grew up with a cohort of buddies. There's probably a dozen of them, and they were all going to Western or Queens or McMaster, and they were all taking very blah, blah, bland programs, business and marketing and whatever. And I actually did think at the time, do I want to be one of them, or do I want to be a little bit different? And so I went to Guelph without really knowing what I wanted to do or what I wanted to get out of Guelph. But I love the city. I love the campus. And I just had this idea in my head, let me be a little different from everyone else. And that's how it turned out, for better or for worse.
And did you, when you went to Guelph, I want you to talk a little bit about what you chose to take and why. And did you think that you would work off the farm, or was there any idea of actually going back and getting into agriculture from that perspective? Or did you always think, I'm going to work in the industry and do something within it?
Yeah, that is a great question. So back at that time, so we're talking about late 70s into the early 80s, there was not a lot of money in agriculture, and a lot of parents, and my dad included, encouraged me not to come back to the farm. So I think today, maybe the last 10 or 15 years, the tables have turned. So now, I do some work with the University of Guelph, and they find they're having a hard time attracting grad students, because all of a sudden, not only do they have to compete with, the from industry, government, the banks, but also from parents wanting their kids to come back because their farm operations are growing and they want the help. So my dad actually discouraged me to come back to the farm. And in fact, his line was, there's easier ways to make a living. I went into Guelph not knowing what I wanted to do. And my career, I made a decision based on, I fell in love with the intro economic courses. I just found them really interesting and engaging. And then I found out that the only way to get a BSc from the University of Guelph without taking organic chemistry was to take an Aggie Econ degree. So I'd say I kind of stumbled into it. Year one was more general courses. I think I had made the decision that, yes, I'm going to stay and work in this sector, in agri-food, the larger agri-food sector. And then just kind of fell in with economics, and away you went. That's how I kind of set my path.
Well, let's dig into Guelph a little more, because we have to talk about essentially the namesake of this podcast is Aggie Allstars. So how did you find the hockey team, and kind of any stories that you might be willing to go public here?
Yeah, for sure. So I started playing hockey when I was a little kid, just like most Canadians. It was a little bit of a shock to my mom, who had grown up with three sisters. Both we were Jewish, so I'd say on my mom's side there was no affinity for hockey for sure. But of course, living in a neighborhood, we played street hockey, and I started playing ice hockey when I was young. I switched to being a goalie when I was about 10 years old, mainly because of Ken Dryden, who I thought looked really cool. So when I went to Guelph, I found out, hey, if you're a student at Guelph, you can go out and try out for the varsity team. They have to give you 3 practices. So knucklehead that I am, I showed up. On the first practice, the captain of the Griffs was a guy named Ray Irwin, who had been the captain of the Oshawa Generals, where I grew up. And he came in on me and took a shot that to this day I never saw. It went over my ear and into the net. So I knew I was out of my league. But the cool thing was I did get a chance to talk to the goalie coach, and he gave me some pointers. And then I found out there's this team called the Aggie Allstars. It was coached by a gentleman named Dennis Murr. And now I forget the assistant coach's name. It's just gone right out of my head. I can picture him, big, tall guy with fuzzy hair. And it was kind of I guess you'd call it a club team. And we would play other college team. We would play other colleges. The fun thing about that was practices were at 6 or 7 a.m. on Friday mornings. So as you know, Rhett, I know a bit about your history. Thursday night is pub night at the University of Guelph.
Yep.
So you'd be out pubbing till somewhere after midnight and then have to get up at 6. I was living in Addington Hall, grab my hockey equipment, put it on my back, trudge half a mile to what we lovingly called Pygmy Gardens, the old arena at Guelph. And so I played a year of Aggie All-Star hockey. I don't have any great Aggie All-Star stories. I was just so glad to be there. I was the third goalie. I was the rookie. The other two guys had been there for a while. So I took a big dose of shut up and keep your head down. So I love the hockey. I love the camaraderie. I'm still playing hockey with some of the guys, a guy named Jerry Horst. I met, first week of school in 1981, and we're still playing hockey together, and we played on the Aggie Allstars. So
That's
yeah.
awesome. No, and what would have been the chances of you making one of the classes on Friday morning at that time?
I was so scared of, we were brought up that, you don't fail classes or get bad grades. So I was not someone to skip too many classes, more out of fear than, I actually did a stupid thing, Rhett. So as you would know, you played on the team too. The big event for the Aggie All-Stars was a tournament in Sudbury, right? Sudbury or Sault Ste. Marie. It was one of the
Sudbury.
two.
Yep. Yep.
And like I said, I was the third goalie, and I had a couple of midterms, and I declined to go to the tournament, which I have very few regrets in my life, but because every year someone would get arrested and there'd be some great story. Those are the stories you're looking for. Knucklehead Len stayed home and worked on his exam prep.
Well, that's good because you obviously graduated from the University of Guelph in good standing, and so take me from there to how a farm boy from near Oshawa, Ontario, ends up in Philadelphia.
Yeah, so this was started out as a sad story that turned out well. I think we are all wired a certain way, and will be attractive to some employers, not to others. And I had really good grades, and I had a pretty well-rounded resume, and but I was having trouble getting a job offer. So most of my class had, by time March rolled around, had job offers from the banks or the crop protection companies or the government. And in fact, in our last class as a cohort, Sandy Worley was my academic advisor, and he was the kind of professor emeritus, and he would say, every class, who's got a job? And all the hands would go up until this, around this time of year, early to mid-March, there's only 3 of us who didn't have jobs. And he would just give you that sad, disappointed look, like you've not only let me down, you've let the whole school down. But then I was going through the Globe and Mail one day, and I saw an ad, and it said, we're looking for a master's student in agricultural economics. Didn't say where the job was. And being jobless and fearless, I applied for the job. I got an interview, and I got in, and they said, but you don't have a master's. I said, well, I know a bunch of those master's students, and I'm smarter than them, and I'll work harder than them, and I'll be cheaper than them. And, with nothing to lose, I took my shot, and I actually got a job offer. And then they said, do you mind moving? I said, where to? And the job just happened to be in Philadelphia. So Chase Econometrics was a subsidiary of Chase Manhattan Bank. It was an econometric forecasting company, and they had once you build an econometric model of kind of the North American ag economy, it's just the Canadian model was just a subset of that, and they needed someone to grind the numbers. I could easily have done the job from my basement or Guelph or Toronto, but the job happened to be in Philadelphia. And to be honest, over the years, that's probably done more good for me than anything else. There's still a little bit of a glow that, hey, you got hired and you worked in the United States. But in reality, I was doing a job, fortunate enough to get the job. Fortunate it was in Philadelphia. But the best part, Rhett, is I met my wife down there. So we ended up.
Next question. Yes.
She was working at Chase at the same time, and I won't go into the whole story. She wouldn't like me to. There's some parts where she's not as happy with me as others. Like when I went back to Guelph to do my master's instead of staying there and marrying her. Yep. But as they say, all's well that ends well.
Yeah, and you met your wife, and then you both share a lifelong passion for NFL football and the Philadelphia Eagles.
Exactly. I actually liked the Eagles before I met my
Really?
wife.
Really?
So my next door neighbor was a guy named Pat Plishka, and he played at Queens, and they I forget which year, it would have been in 83 or 84,
Yeah.
and he was a lineman, and his fellow lineman was a guy named Mike Shad, who was drafted by the Eagles. Very
Right.
rare those days for a Canadian. So through him, I got to know a bit about the Eagles, and he'd get invited down, and they'd party at Randall Cunningham's place. And so I like the Eagles. I used to love the Flyers. Bernie Perrant was one of my
Yep.
idols growing up. So I always had an affinity for Philadelphia. So when I moved there, it actually felt extremely comfortable and still one of my favorite places in the world, the city of brotherly love.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So to take me through, actually, I was not aware you did your master's while you going back and forth, I guess, Philadelphia. Talk me through that, because that's a pretty stressful time of life to try to do that and work and all those types of things, and the
Yeah.
decision to do it at that time of life, right?
Well, you're very kind, Rhett, A, in interviewing me, and B, you're kind of implying that there was something smart and strategic about it. But again, I had reached another crossroads where I had worked down at Chase for a couple of years. And frankly, I had really enjoyed my time at University of Guelph, and I don't think I was quite ready to grow up. So I reached out to the chairman, Dr. Larry Martin, and said, hey, I'm thinking about doing a master's. And he said, come on down. And there was funding. And so for better or for worse, it was more of a delay the inevitable. If I look back now, I had a farm background and undergrad degree in Aggie Econ. It probably would have made more sense to do a complementary degree, something like an MBA. And I was in the US. I could have
Yeah.
maybe thought about going to Wharton or something like that. Went back, did my master's, and about halfway through my master's, I realized this is not what I want to do with my life. Because I always tell people economics is really interesting field, but it's a little bit like a lobster trap. Really interesting at the front end, really easy to get into. But halfway through my master's, I realized, hey, this is really microeconomics is really applied math. And I was always an English guy going back to high school. I always thought I'd be a journalist or a writer. And, for various reasons, I didn't pursue that, possibly a lack of talent. But so I was not wired as a mathematician. And here I was with a math degree. Basically, it's an economics degree. So when I graduated, I did have a couple of job offers in the field. I could have been a practicing economist. And then I had this weird job offer from American Cyanamid, which is now part of BASF, for an entry-level marketing position. And really, again, not that I envisioned my career going down that path, but I knew it wasn't going to be as an economist. So I made that decision, joined Cyanamid, became a product manager and a sales manager. And one of the great things I'll say about Cyanamid, but about any of the multinational companies, whether it's seed or crop protection, they really do train you well. So
Yeah.
essentially, in the first year, I worked in every department, learned a little bit about everything, went through some crisis management and things like that. And I'll forever be grateful to one of my mentors is a guy named Tom Schmidt, and he was the general manager there. And he wasn't the nice, kindly, grandfatherly mentor. He was the get in your face and demand results kind of mentor. And it changed my life forever, just that sense of accountability and drive and hitting your number, which was a concept I'd never heard of before.
Awesome. So take me from American Cyanamid, and then you obviously had been thinking about, you talked about your like of copywriting and English and those types of things, and how that likely, I'm assuming, led into eventually connecting with Ginty. Am I assuming that wrong? How did that connection happen from essentially corporate America, essentially, right, to the very creative side of the industry?
So eventually in my journey with Cyanamid, I ended up working primarily in the marketing department. And it was a pretty cool time because Cyanamid was launching a product called Pursuit, which was the first, now I'll pronounce it wrong, imidacloprid product, the IMIs, new
Right.
classic chemistry. And it was pretty much a miracle compound in the soybean market in North America. And I had a chance. I was not the lead. I was working with a guy named Bruce Jowett, and you may know Bruce, fairly well known in the industry, and he was leading the charge. But we had a pretty robust product line, and I got to go work with the agency. So at one point, I was working in the marketing department. They said you have to go work with the agency, and I said, what's an agency, and what does that mean? They just go there. They'll help you out.
Yeah.
And one of the guys I worked with is a fellow named Peter Honadel, also well known in the industry. And Peter ended up being my account exec, even though I didn't know what that was. And I was a product manager at that time, and I kind of didn't know what that was. Uh, and I was grateful Peter, a little more experienced than I was at the time, and he kind of led me through it. And at a certain point, Rhett, I started to look over at the table and say, these guys seem to be having more fun than I am. So, I think certain people are really well suited for the corporate culture and atmosphere, and others aren't. And I wasn't. I felt somewhat constrained. Corporate tends to be a little, I call it small box, like you have a defined role, and they're not always encouraging you to go beyond that. Whereas the agencies seem to be these free-spirited, free-range knuckleheads who are doing creative things. And at the same time, I have a cousin. His name's Peter Sellers, believe it or not, and he was working for an agency in Toronto called Goodgall Curtis, and he had done this. He had won an award for this ad. You may have seen it. It was a "Don't Drink and Drive" ad, and it was a fella on a. He was on a. It's a dark scene. There's lights, ambulance lights in the background. This guy's got his hand in his head, and the
Yeah.
headline said, "First he killed the bottle." That was the whole ad. So I still get chills when I talk about that. And I decided, you know what? I think that's the life for me. The problem is, no one wants to hire you into an agency if you haven't had agency experience. So I took the better part of a year banging on doors until finally a fella named Ginty Jokas
Yep.
hired me. And so Ginty was one of the leaders in the industry at the time. He's since passed away, and the agency was Ginty Jokas and Associates, and he hired me at a junior level. It got me back to Guelph. Julie and I were living in London. She was going to teachers college. Ended up back in Guelph working for Ginty, and had a really good 3-year run with him. It was interesting because Ginty, it was a boutique agency, and so you got to do a little bit about everything. And at the end of the day, I was frustrated. I wanted to be a partner. I wanted to run the show, and Ginty was pretty clear who was running the show. He actually physically took me outside the office one day. We're having a disagreement, and he pointed to the nameplate on the door and said, "Any questions?" And no, there were no questions. I knew where my place was. So eventually I stepped out, left, and started my own business. Not again with any huge strategy or goal in mind, but really just because I was getting so unhappy, being held back by this mean guy who wouldn't let me reach my full potential. Come to find out, I had learned way more than I thought working for someone like Ginty. And the other thing I learned is how hard it is to run your own business. So about 6 or 8 months in, I actually called him up and I apologized for myself, because I imagine I was a pain in the ass to work with at the time too. And I said, Ginty, I'm starting to get a little glimpse of what it is you go through and what it takes to run an agency. And I think I was able to repair the bridge, and we ended up being, I guess, competitors in the same space, but it ended up at least being cordial. And, I'll forever be grateful. I don't think he set out to be my mentor, but in terms of learning the agency business, both himself, and I had met Ross Harvey early on, and Bob Corrigan, some of the folks from the Parker Group. And if you're willing to listen, there's a lot of really good mentorship out there. And as you would know, because I've met your dad, and he'd be one of those people too, I'm sure.
Yeah. No, it was, and I would say our industry, I think you'd agree, although there's still some of that competitive things. It's not like that Mad Men world. right? It's you do kind of help each other out here and there. I mean, it's kind of like hockey players, right? You're in the game and you're going to fight it out, but you're going to help each other off the ice and things like that. That's why we love our industry, right? So
Yeah. Well, no,
so
that's
take
that's a really good point. So a couple of things, like there is a lot of opportunity to learn, and on reflection, some of the people who taught me the most about our industry are the media reps. So James Shaw, Kevin Lord, Lillian Morris, Don
yeah,
Carruthers. Guy I met early on was Mark Dawson, who's not in the industry anymore. But the media reps knew everything, and they would share it with you. Now, eventually, they want to sell you ad space, but very generous with their time. But to your point, I did have one year of my life where I stepped out of the industry. I had a friend who was starting a medical electronic medical record keeping company, and it was jarring, just the cultural difference. And you get very used to this rhythm in the agri-food industry, where I think we compete really hard for every dollar, for every acre, for every grain of seed. But there's a camaraderie and a willingness to share and to support. And it is different from the outside world. Every time I wander, like you and I sometimes do some work in the food sector, it's a little warmer than maybe the medical field, but it's pretty cutthroat.
yeah, yeah, no,
Yeah.
no doubt. Totally agree. Totally agree.